Hey everyone, welcome. Dominic here with Silhouettes of the Truth. Today we are joined by Scott Gates. Welcome, Scott. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, Dominic.
Now, it's good to have you here. Scott is an editor by day, author by night, and a recent convert to Catholicism. So we're going to get into Scott's story and his two novels in just a moment here. Silhouettes of the Truth, it's the show about fiction for modern Catholic authors. We talk creed, craft, and co-creation rooted in grit, grace, gods, and dragons. Go ahead, hit like, subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Dominic DeSouza, novel lover, all-around Catholic creative, and founder of CatholicAuthor. We're here to inspire your faith and your fiction. Okay, so Scott, I'm curious to hear a little bit of your backstory for your conversion there, and then let's talk about your novel. So, who is Scott, and how did you get to where you are today?
All right. Yes. Thanks for asking. And I do want to get to dragons, and I think I can work it in somewhere. But
Awesome, dragons are always welcome.
Got to check that box. But so, as far as conversion, how I became a Catholic, there's a long version. And I'll keep it to the relatively short version. I kind of journaled it out at one point, and I was just going through page after page. It's complicated for everybody, right? But
to leave out, where to begin?
Yeah, the short of it though is my father was raised Catholic. His family's from Eastern Europe. I feel like that's a part of my personal heritage. That aside, he was not a part of the church by the time I was born. So I was raised in kind of a mix of faiths. We went to a few different types of little community churches. I had Hindu coloring books and listening to Buddhist children's songs and just everything, coming at me, which was good exposure. But as, growing up, I was kind of searching for something to grab onto. We joined an Episcopal church when I was in high school, junior high school, and that really started to resonate with me. Through college, I was attending Episcopal churches. My wife, who I met in my mid to late 20s, was raised Catholic. So I had been exposed to the Catholic Church before that. I'd gone to Mass with a friend before, and I was like, hey, this is like the Episcopal Church, but, not quite. So through my wife, I started to understand more about the church. And it's interesting because she had started to stray a little bit herself. And so kind of together, I started taking an interest in it, kind of brought her back some, and we both started growing in our faith together. So she wasn't encouraging me to convert or anything. Her family wasn't, talking about it at all. We were married in the Catholic Church. And then from there, I just started to realize, one, how important it was to have a strong foundation for our family that we were planning. And two, the more I was a part of the Catholic Church, the more it really resonated with me as the only thing that made sense for me. And I'll talk to my brother about this. My brother's not a Catholic, but I'll explain my faith to him every now and again, and I'll get all excited around Easter or something like that and start explaining it to him. And so I always have to say, like, if you're going to be, this is just the way, this makes the most sense. If you look at it factually, that's another thing that appeals to me, the history of it, the facts, it's all there. And we just kind of also like that, as Catholics, we're kind of held to a higher standard. And we can talk about that more. I think that applies to everything we do. We need to try to bring glory to God in our writing and everything. So so in 2009, but this is before we had kids, I went through RCIA, and my wife went through it with me. And so she learned, kind of strengthened her faith too. And then I was in a parish in Northern Virginia when I joined the church. So it's hard to believe it's been more than 10 years now, but I'm so thankful that that's the path that I ended up taking. So,
wow. Yeah. Wow. So tell us a little bit more about your novels then. Have you always been a writer? Something that came out more recently?
So I've always had an interest in writing, but when I was younger, it was more personal essays, some poetry. I'd write some short stories. As you mentioned, my day job is editor, so I'm a magazine editor. Went to school for journalism. So that's, I've written countless articles as far as that goes, but I'd never thought that I had it in me to write any long form fiction until 2012. My wife, we didn't have kids yet, so I had some time to kill. My wife was doing exercise classes that I wasn't joining her for, so I was just like sitting around waiting on her at some point, and started writing a story about, I didn't know what it was going to be. I thought it was a short story about a guy after the Civil War. He's a good guy, but bad things keep happening to him. And the more I kind of teased out that story, I was like, well, I could write some more about this. And then it just kind of kept going to the point where I started framing out chapters. And then now that's, however many years later, that's Hard Road South, my first novel. So that was not something I sat down and one day and said, I'm going to write a novel. It just kind of happened. And I realized once I got into the rhythm that kind of long form fiction writing is really relaxing to me. It's kind of a stress reliever almost when I can work it in. So, when I was done with that, I started another story I had in mind, and that's my second novel, Gone the Redeemer. So, that's kind of my writing background. I guess you'd say right now I'm doing more long form fiction, and it tends to be historical fiction. Again, not sure why I was necessarily drawn to that, but I do like that genre.
That's brilliant. I'm curious, why did the Civil War era fascinate you? And then, like, what's a snapshot of this character and how he endures and where he ends up?
Yeah, so it's pretty obvious if you step back and look at what was happening at the time. We were living in Northern Virginia, and that's the DC area. We were in Manassas. Manassas is the site of the first major battle of the Civil War. So there's Civil War history everywhere. I pass the battlefield every day on my way to work. It's beautiful, just nice drive, but that kind of history is everywhere. And the town where the novel's mainly set is Middleburg, which is a beautiful town kind of in the horse country in the foothills of the Shenandoah. And there's a tavern there that dates back hundreds of years. That kind of history to me in a building was new, because I grew up in Alabama. We had battlefields and things like that, but there wasn't a deep history like that. Most anything that had been built out of wood centuries ago has, collapsed and faded into the landscape. So that just was interesting to me, that history that was so ingrained in the communities that had since built up and sprawled into what they are today. And then as far as that character, in 2012, my father was diagnosed with lung cancer. So, that kind of dawned on me fairly recently. I was like, oh yeah, bad things happening to a good guy. And, that's probably where that character came out of. His story is he is a Union veteran. So he was living in Connecticut after the Civil War. He didn't have much holding him to the place he'd called home. He'd seen parts of Virginia during the war and was called back to it, kind of wanted to start over. And for lack of a better term, he was a carpetbagger that came down from the north to start a new life in the south, not looking to take advantage of anybody, but the community that he ended up in, many perceived him as that just because of the nature of the time. So takes place about 5 years after the Civil War in the Reconstruction era. That period interested me because I just didn't know much about it from a day-to-day perspective. You hear about the complicated politics of the time, but I wanted to kind of get into how it affected families just trying to get by. So that's kind of my starting point for that.
Man, normally, well, so far in this show, the kinds of novels and stuff we've been talking about are more not just fiction, but fantasy. So I'd ask stuff like, how does world building happen? But it's kind of different because you're writing historical fictions. How much research did you find yourself doing? Like, my personal problem is I will stop working on a project because I will overdo my, air quotes, need for research. And I end up going too far. How did you find a balance, or how did you make that work for you?
Yeah, I find that that's one thing that appeals to me about historical fiction is that, tying it to a real time and place can kind of prompt plot developments.
Right.
And I've found that to be a really useful tool. So research, I had a general sense of the time, but really it comes down to these characters who are people behaving as we would, responding to things. Of course, they're influenced some by the time itself, but when you boil it down, they're people reacting to things that happen in their lives the way we would. So that was interesting to me, and that made it easy just to kind of start rolling with it. Now, when I was really careful, I relied on a map actually from it was from like the 1850s. Maybe there was a map of the county where it's set that was really detailed, and I relied heavily on that to kind of make sure that it was rooted in the right place, the towns, and if he was walking somewhere, would he pass a mill? I wanted all that accounted for.
Oh,
But
that's cool.
yeah, and I've come to rely on maps a good bit. My second novel, I used a railway map from the 1880s to kind of map out the
nice.
West. So that's a big help to me, kind of setting that sense of place.
Tell you what's awesome is Google Earth. I remember almost 10 years ago, I was trying to play something in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
And being able to just like pull that up and see the distances and try to imagine if I was on the ground, what would I be able to see? And
yeah, that is really helpful. And again, these tools, I think we need to just use what we have. And I was kind of bashful at first because a lot of my research is online. I'll be writing and I'll Google something. And I had some books and historical documents for Hard Road South, but I use what you've got. And like you're saying, my second novel takes place out west. So I had lived for a period out west, but the landscape changes so dramatically out there so quickly.
okay.
So I would I would do the little street view on wherever I was in New Mexico and be like, okay, well, it's kind of scrubland out here. So then I would, be able to be a little more accurate. But as far as research goes, I tend to just do it as needed. But I'll try not to get stuck on things. I remember I got somewhat hung up on Tabasco sauce in Hard Road South because I wanted to start. This was an interesting time. So like the late 1860s, 1870s is when some brands and things that are a part of our culture now, pop culture, started to emerge. Baseball, Tabasco sauce, things like that. So, but Tabasco, I like threaded the needle as far as, it's pretty early for Tabasco, but they could have had it up in Virginia at that time. So that's the kind of thing, I just I don't want Tabasco calling and saying that wasn't available in 1869.
I was trying to write a fantasy novel like a decade ago, and I got all hung up because I realized I don't know what flowers are growing in Northern Europe in springtime.
Yeah.
And I had no idea how to find that answer. I should have just moved on and come back and added those if I could find those details later. It's almost more important to actually just get the story done. But I was such a perfectionist.
Oh, I've wrung hands over wildflowers. But it's also part of just immersing yourself in wherever you're writing and hopefully bringing the reader along too.
Well, so I'm curious what you think about this. This is something that's actually, how do I say this? It's a piece of writing advice that I find I can keep walking around it and keep pulling stuff out of it. And it's the line that says, write what you know. And when I first heard that, the first thing I felt was, dang it, I'm shackled. Now I can't write about anything because what do I know about anything else? But the more that I sit with that, and I think it's a really great response to this kind of problem. If you're, I don't know, maybe like you and I, a kind of writer where research is kind of a bane, I'm finding a really good answer is to ask yourself, what would my character realistically know? If my character is a gunslinger, say, or a Civil War soldier, would they realistically know the names of any flower or tree? Would they even notice them? And that can be a great exercise to tighten up the author voice in your story, is sometimes stop doing, God mode or third person omniscient, describing everything and then describing the character, get into their head and only describe what they would see and then use the terms that they would see it in. And that's a really great way to differentiate voices. But it's also a bit of a relief. For example, I'm a designer, right? Or a marketer. I work with computers a lot. That's my frame of reference for thinking about everything, because that's just how I approach things. I'm not going to see the world the way a military advisor would, or even the way a soldier would, or a gardener. So in a way, those details can't intrude into how I tell the story because it's not in character.
Yeah, that's a great way to make things more approachable. Definitely.
And I think it could be a good way to dial in the amount of research you actually need to do as well.
Yeah, definitely. I found, so my second, I don't want to jump, if it's confusing to jump between novels, stop me. But
Sure.
So Gone the Redeemer, my second novel, that's will be released in June. But I wrote that in first person, which I'd never written in before. And at first it was awkward and challenging, but then I got into it and it was a lot of fun. But that character, he liked horses for what they were, which was to him a means of transportation. And so horses were always on his mind. He would spot breeds and things like that. And for whatever reason, he liked birds. And I didn't ever spell out, this guy likes birds. It was just, I noticed that in certain scenes, it made sense for him to like take note of this bird that was there. So that was one thing that kind of kept coming back. And, that's how people are. Some people are drawn to trees. They might notice that, like you're saying, more than others or whatever. So as long as you can just kind of dial it in a little bit for your character to where it makes sense, what they're taking note of, you can still do that world building without having to go nuts, obsessing about every little piece of it.
Yeah. Have you read Brandon Sanderson?
No, I've not.
No. He's a popular fantasy author now. Every novel is like a thick tome. But what's cool is that he will do all of this phenomenal, incredible world building, absolutely detailed. But then he is just as phenomenally rigorous about how he filters that world building through the perceptions of his characters. And if they don't notice something, then he'll kind of describe it, but the character won't understand it, and they'll keep moving because the character would keep moving. The world building it's all still there, but it allows it to be unpacked later on. And then the reader can go back and go, oh, now I know what that was. But, it can be a really clever way to, well, one, stay focused, and also not, avoid info dumping.
Right.
And just too much world building because, you're excited but about sharing all of this stuff. But the characters maybe that character wouldn't pay attention. Maybe the archaeologist character would,
And I love those details that a reader can come back to when there's more context 5 chapters later. And then, I'm hoping they make that connection like, oh man, there was a missed opportunity back there or whatever it might be, kind of builds on itself that way.
Yeah. I want to ask you about that in a second, whether you find your stories are more character driven or event driven or a combo of both. But first, do you have a favorite legend or a favorite story that you grew up with that you like to go back to? And so, what does that say to you?
Yeah. So I think, there are many. And if you want to talk fantasy, I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. And I had first read that. This isn't my answer, but I first read Lord of the Rings. I read The Hobbit when I was younger. I could never get past chapter 1 in Fellowship of the Ring, where he's going into Hobbit, lineage, I think.
Verse,
I don't know. Yeah. And so once finally I came back to it and I got through that chapter, I was like, oh, this is excellent. And you can appreciate that more too after you've read the whole thing. But so then I was after college, I was hiking the Appalachian Trail. I made it to Virginia from the start, so I didn't do the whole thing, but I was in the woods a lot. And that's when I really got into it. So to be reading Lord of the Rings while you're on a trail for 2 months, that was a pretty cool experience.
What an experience.
Yeah.
What a frame of mind.
You kind of look at those vistas with a different pair of eyes when you're reading about all that. But as far as, another legend, myth, whatever you want to call it, and that's another whole conversation, I suppose. But the Odyssey always resonated with me when I was studying it back in school. And what's interesting to me is how not necessarily, I'm not going to sit down and read the Odyssey now cover to cover, and maybe one day when I have time on my hands. But I think what's most interesting about that epic journey is how often it comes back in other stories. And we talk about, I mentioned Tolkien. So the Hobbit itself, he pulled elements from the Odyssey and building out the Hobbit. For shout out to some other North Carolina authors, Cold Mountain by Charles Frazier and Big Fish, Daniel Wallace, they both pull in elements from the Odyssey. Film wise, have you seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
A long time ago.
Yeah, it's a Coen Brothers film, but I think that's great. And that's just like very obviously building on the Odyssey. So, or kind of retelling the Odyssey. So, my Gone the Redeemer, my second novel, is a journey tale, and it's pretty epic. I didn't set out looking to retell the Odyssey. I was maybe even avoiding it because I didn't want to fall into that category. But by the end of it, the character himself has to acknowledge some similarities between his path and that of Odysseus. So it's almost unavoidable when you're telling a journey tale, because that, so fully captured all these different things that can happen along a journey and these side tracks that a character might find himself in. So
yeah, well, that segues perfectly then to the next question. Whether you're more character driven or event driven, and I want to loving the Odyssey the way that you do. What is it that you love about it? Is it the kind of almost Arabian Nights-esque variety of different episodic things that he works his way through, or is it the internal process of transformation as his character meets and is changed by each one of these different episodes till he gets to the end and he's a different person than at the beginning or something?
I mean, I think both of those. I like the idea that and this is just life. You can't plan for anything. I'm gonna drive to Atlanta. Great. So I can't necessarily, I can plan out, here's a rest area where I can hit, but you can't ever plan anything. Stuff's going to come up along the way that you don't expect, and you have to adapt to that. And the longer the journey, the more epic the journey, the more epic those side tracks can get. So inevitably, when you're on a longer journey, you're going to have experiences that can change you fundamentally. And this is what happens to these characters. That's what happens to the character in Gone the Redeemer. Again, he's not looking to be changed, but he's inevitably changed by the people he meets and the things he experiences. So as far as what I'm more drawn to, I suppose it's character driven, because again, like I said, I'm really interested in kind of the human response to things being fairly universal, and just kind of exploring how people would react in these different times and places. But, a big part of that is also putting a lot of thought into what these times and places might present to the characters. So there's a balance there in my writing, at least.
No, that's great. That's great. I want to ask you about your writing process. And you mentioned your day job is an editor. One, what is your writing process? Is there like a schedule, certain things you like to do, like a little ritual, or do you find being an editor intrudes into that, like your editor mind, or do you have to like switch that off and just focus on the creative side?
Well, I think one reason that fiction is a release for me is because it's whatever I want to make it. So, my editor mode is very fact-based, and you got to get things right. Everything's got to be fact-checked, and in fiction writing, it is, you're the owner of the facts. So historical fiction, there's a little more, wanting to get things right, like I mentioned. And also, you need to be culturally sensitive if you're basing it in the real world, to make sure that when you're pulling in these different characters, you get their perspectives right. You don't want to offend somebody by, somebody's past experience not properly shaping who they should be or would be, if that makes sense. But
yeah, no, it does.
anyway, let's come. What's the root of that question again? I've kind
Yeah.
of
The question was, well, first, your writing process. Do you have one fixed time every day? You write for 3 hours, take a
The
shower
way that,
afterwards?
yes, thanks for course correcting me. Though that was my influence as an editor on my writing, so I try to put that aside. I'm happy to put that aside. But as far as the editing process, I know a lot of writers will get something down and then they want words on the page and they'll go back through and do rewrites and all that. I tend to obsess about at least sections as I go. So by the time I have a full manuscript, in my mind, it's relatively clean. Of course, everybody needs an editor, and my publisher will always have feedback and comments and copy editing to do to tighten things up. But for the most part, from my perspective, I don't feel like it needs any more fine tuning at that point. So just because I've put that work in as I've gone through it. And as far as outlining and everything, I don't plot it out too thoroughly ahead of time. I know it's plotting or pantsing. I'm kind of plantsing because I have an idea of the story I want to tell. I kind of know where I want the characters to end up. I might even know the ending, but I don't know how I get there. And the ending will change from time to time. But so as I go, I might be able to map out the first 10 chapters. And I have a sense of what's going to happen after that. But as I'm getting through those 10 chapters, it might change. So I'm kind of open to that because I guess focusing on the characters, that happens. They do different things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So
no, that's great. I want to ask you about the I don't know what it's called, the doldrums, or you get to the middle 60% mark or even the 40% mark of the book, and the glow is faded and it's starting to feel like a slog until you get towards the end. Maybe how do you did you have that, or if you did, what was your way to either muscle through it or kind of work your way with it, or did you have to deal with anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. So Hard Road South took me about 5 years to write, maybe 6. And that was mainly because of this long break. And like you're saying, I probably got to I was about a third of the way through it, maybe a little more. And my job at the time in Virginia, kind of my role expanded. It got a lot more stressful. I didn't have as much time I didn't have anything left in me when I came home,
Right.
And so eventually we made a move to North Carolina, and I was just the whole quality of life down here is different. Northern Virginia is there's a lot of people. It's pretty sprawly. It takes a long time to get anywhere. I was spending 2+ hours in traffic every day. So now I'm 20 minutes from work. That can make a big difference on somebody. And I think I just all of a sudden had that creative part of me was kind of freed up again because I didn't have all these pressures from, living life. I mean, they're there. We have 3 young kids, but I was able to kind of nurture that creative side to where it was an outlet for whatever stresses I had. I found a way to work with that creative side to kind of help me along. So that's when I was able to pick up the novel again and just kind of move on through it. So, and since then, I've needed to have some kind of project going on. Whereas, before, like I'd said, in Northern Virginia, I just think the stresses of everyday life were a little much for me to even consider that. So kind of sad that my stress relief, I couldn't figure out how to work that in when I was really stressed. But anyway,
well, no, I don't blame you or anything. I think that if you got to take the time, then you got to do that. I've been in a bit of a creative rut for about 10 years or so, and even though it's something that I absolutely love, at the same time, your right brain just shuts down when the left is in survival mode, and you got to gather data and survive. And I think just you do what you got to do. I mean, obviously, if it's your day job and you're Stephen King and writing novels that's your thing, well, that's a very different sort of thing. I think it is very, very important to be very patient with yourself.
That's a good way to to put it as far as the left and right side of your brain. And I think I've since learned some exercises to work through it, because like I said, we have 3 little kids. There's no shortage of distractions.
Yeah.
And usually my writing is done after they're asleep. So there's a narrow window when I can do that. And not doing it every night. I'm not even doing it every week. But I feel like if you can find a way to do something with your work in progress or whatever it might be, regularly, and ultimately set a goal for yourself, even if it's 3 times a week. That might be writing, and that's great, because that's ultimately what you're trying to do. But it also might be a little bit of plotting, and that's an achievement. I'll sit down sometimes and be able to plan out, a section of 10 chapters that I need to write. That's a big deal, because then I kind of have a roadmap going forward, and that takes some thought. Even you might even do a little revising, go back and reread the last chapter you wrote and think about what might change or if that's right. And in doing that, you might get another couple paragraphs written that night. So it's just kind of a matter of having those touch points with your work. You don't have to set a goal for a chapter a week or anything like that. I think it's just a matter of staying engaged with it.
I think so too. I want to ask a question about historical fictions, because that's, of course, your space here. How did you you mentioned earlier wanting to respect people of different experiences and different backgrounds, and I'm curious how you handled that, because I've often thought about that, and I'm thinking about historical novels and realizing I have no idea, short of grabbing somebody and sitting them down for 2 hours over coffee, but how to authentically or respectfully understand them from the inside out. I'm curious, did that come up much? Did you have a rule of thumb for how you handled that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So, and I'm going to, for a recent example, I'm going to point to Gone the Redeemer. That's kind of that book takes place the American West of 1898. So it's transitional period for the West. That's as close to writing a Western as I'm going to get. It's, it's a time when Denver has electric lights strung up. There's still some cowboys out there. They might be out of work from time to time, but it is an interesting transition. There's cars on the road, but mainly trains and horses are still prevalent. So part of what I wanted to do with that book was kind of address some of these stereotypes that have been perpetuated by pulp Westerns back in the 50s, like pulp Western novels and movies. And so I wrote an Apache character. And I was thinking to myself when I set out to do it, I was like, what's kind of one of the scary tribes out there that you always hear horror stories about in the pulp Westerns? And Apache were pretty fearsome at the time, especially, settlers were cringing at even the mention of the name. And so I wrote the character ended up being, though, an Apache woman with a child who served as a guide to the main character at one point. And their story grows together, and she has her own motivations and her own goals too. So that's all kind of unpacked throughout the course of the novel. In writing her, I obviously was very aware of the need to be accurate in her worldview. So I did a lot of research as I wrote, pulling from resources from the Mescalero Apache tribe where she's from, and just kind of sat down and read about their worldview, especially at the time, their religion, how they would approach different things, and then tried to apply that and pull that in where I could. So, it's done. Manuscripts on the desk. You hope you've done a good job, but I don't know. So I reached out to the Apache tribe and got in touch with the cultural director. He manages their museum on the reservation in Mescalero, and he'd had the manuscript for a few months. He gave me a call back this morning, believe it or not, and we talked through it for about 40 minutes. And he had mostly good feedback. He had some, tweaks to spellings here and there, but he got the character, liked what she was doing. I'd mentioned when I sent it to him, I was like, you don't really have to read anything up until page 120 or whenever she comes on. And sure enough, he was like, yeah, it got more interesting to me once she was introduced. but so I feel much better about it now. That's because I was able to just have that sensitivity reader up front before it goes to press. So if you have that opportunity to talk to somebody with those experiences, or somebody who might be familiar, if it's historical, with that period of time. Then I think that's important due diligence as an author, and also it can help you learn and bring more to your work. So
as you did that kind of digging and research, did you find, well, one, new story ideas were coming up. Did you find yourself changing in, like, as an author, as a writer? Did new things sort of open up, or new points of view? Or I'm curious if that doing that, entering into that, such a different headspace than where you are now, did that do anything for you?
Yeah, well, it definitely, in understanding her character more and why she might be motivated to do different things, it led to different places in the book than I would have been able to plan otherwise.
Wow.
So, that's, again, call that character driven, I guess. But I'm glad to hear that her motivations made sense to somebody familiar with her worldview. But, I guess it goes to show that if you do some good research and really, again, just apply these things to the basic human condition, understanding some of the nuances of their culture that might lead them to make different decisions or be motivated to do different things. But don't be afraid to write different characters with different perspectives, because, again, you write what you know. Well, you know what it's like to be a person trying to get by in the world. So write that, and then try to apply it with a different perspective. And like you said, you're inevitably going to learn some things along the way.
No, I think that's great. That's great. I want to ask how people can get in touch with you. But before then, you did mention in the beginning you wanted to touch on maybe dragons and work that in somehow. I got to bring that back up and ask, what did you want to share on that front?
Well, I hit it, The Hobbit. So
there you go.
Yeah,
okay.
As far as the being inspired by the Odyssey, there's I don't know. Can't beat Smog. He's
Well, I can't remember who it was. It might have been I can't remember the name of the speaker. He wrote a book on the Hobbit, but anyhow, you were pointing out that there are two Smogs, and three in the Hobbit. Bilbo and what's the name of the leader of the dwarves? Drawn a blank. Not Theoden.
It's been a while.
I don't remember anymore. All the wrong names are showing up.
It's on the shelf right over there, but I don't think.
Anyhow, so Bilbo was also a dragon coiled in a cave and not wanting to leave it and needing that journey to discover himself, emerge from himself, face reality, and grow. And I thought that was a really great insight into a more latent message that sometimes meeting a dragon reveals what kind of dragon you are yourself.
Yeah. Like that. I've not heard
how can people get in touch with you, Scott?
So if you remember Scott M. Gates, that unlocks everything. So you can go to scottmgates.com, and there's some information about me, and you can get in touch with me there. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Scott M. Gates. So please check it out, because especially Instagram, I like just sharing things from my life here in North Carolina, and I'm inspired by a lot of it. I grew up in Alabama, grew up in the South, and I think there's so many interesting experiences we have here in the South. So, I'm often taking a picture of an old broken down gas station or something and sharing it on Instagram. So
it is a cool profile. Last I checked, you did book readings as well.
As far as other authors?
No, I think I've seen you do book readings, and you've shown different books or different places that you've read at, where you're going
for my
into
own work.
Yeah.
That's just part of. So I released Hard Road South in May 2020. So if you put that on the calendar, that's right when the pandemic was getting weird. So I've done a lot of that was a virtual launch, and from my experience as an author, it's been virtual. So I kind of had to adapt to figure out the medium. But the good thing about that is that it's easy to share with others. And so there's a reading or two on those social channels.
Nice. Well, I'll put the links in the show notes so folk can check them out. As we wrap up, Scott, if you had 1 minute to share a message of encouragement from one author to another, one Catholic author to another Catholic author, what would you want to say?
Well, I think for me, remember to find creative inspiration in our faith. And that's something that has kind of grounded my writing through it all. For one, there's a prayer that I say often, and that's that I might be able to use my talents to better serve my family. And so a part of that in my mind is writing. Sometimes I'll sit down to write too, and I'll say a prayer there, just something short, to please God, please work through me so that I might put words on the page that resonate with people, that might have some meaning to others. So I think it's important to bring that in, even in small ways, to your writing. And also, when I was writing Hard Road South, I was attending weekly adoration that our parish offered. That allowed for some time for personal reflection and just that quiet time where there were some creative sparks that happened there. And it's, to other Catholics, you might get it. I can credit some plot points to Mary, I would say, because I'm sitting there in front of the statue of Mary and praying, saying the Hail Mary. Then all of a sudden something just clicks. I'm like, oh, this is what this character should do, because I was at a, like you said, stuck or hung up on something. So it helped me work through things. So I just find ways to bring your faith into it in little ways. And it doesn't have to be overtly written into into the stories that you're telling, but also I do try to find ways to give nods, and I'm trying to find more ways to bring my faith into the actual content that I'm writing, in subtle ways, just to expose more to the Catholic faith. And
fantastic. No, I think that what you've described, especially the authentic treatment, the real treatment of the human journey and how a human interacts and, grapples with what it means to respond with good to when bad is done, or to just the inner pull to want to do something wrong or respond in kind. That is a writing out of your faith, from that place as well. It doesn't always have to be icons and crucifixes on everything and priests walking down the road. It can simply just be the real treatment of how, grit and grace and dragons work in and on people.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it.
There you go. Scott, it was really good to spend the time with you. Thanks for coming on today.
Oh, this is great. I appreciate it. This has been fun.
Wonderful. And for those who are watching or you're listening, please press like, subscribe, leave a review, and follow this channel. Share it with the one friend that you think would really like to see it. Catholic Author is a project by smart Catholics. You're invited to join the creative community for the modern Catholic author. We're helping Catholic authors grow, connect, and keep writing. Sign up today at CatholicAuthor.us. Till next time, keep writing.